And the camera for that is there. Hello and welcome to everyone who's joining us online and in this room at the beautiful campus of Glasgow University. And it is a beautiful day outside. I hope that wherever you're listening from, it is beautiful and that you're ready for this interesting and exploratory session in which we're going to talk about AI and how it can accelerate legislation and policymaking in order to bring us to a lower carbon and resilient world. A lot of us here have been doing climate change work and climate policy work for a long time. A lot of you are studying it probably or engaging with it in various ways. And the way that we are used to doing our research and our policy work is a little bit behind the speed that we need to move things in order to reach our target of reaching a 1.5 degree world at the most, and one that allows equity and one that allows sustainable societies to thrive and not just only to survive. We're in the 21st century and technology has taken us a long way, and we've got to the moon, we've got to Mars, we've got to many places. We are doing ridiculously amazing things as a human race, and yet somehow our policymaking processes and our governance structures are stuck behind. And when they're stuck behind, it means that our decision-making is not optimal. It means that we're susceptible to forces that want to drive us in certain ways. And sometimes those forces are driving us in the wrong direction. And if we want to make this a very, very rapid transition, one that brings us closer to utopia rather than to dystopia, we have to ask ourselves, what do we need to do? How do we harness those 21st century technologies and beyond? I'm hoping that the human race will be around for the 22nd century, though we're not doing a very good job at guaranteeing that at the moment. And as we do that, we need to ask ourselves some very hard questions, both on how do we do better, but also how do we make sure that we're not making it worse for ourselves? So we have an interesting session that is probably not your usual Law and Governance Day session, which is a long-running tradition of coming and talking about the research that we do and the last paper that we wrote and some innovative approaches to thinking about a legal problem. But we're going to be talking about the tools and the way that we do our work. And we're going to do it through this spark in which I want you to imagine knowledge flowing. Knowledge is created, knowledge has to flow through systems, and knowledge has to be put to use. And when we do that, we ask ourselves, what are the points of blockage that block us from creating knowledge effectively, from moving it to the right places, to the right people at the right time, and in a way that enables us to make decisions better, to legislate better, to hold our governments to account, to hold our legislators to account, to take them to court if they don't live up to what we need, to take corporations to court, to take citizens to court if they are personally accountable for things that they shouldn't be doing. And all of that while making sure that knowledge and evidence is being put to use. And how do we get people to use knowledge in a way that is effective? So we're going to have this session with 4 speakers. I will be the first of them, and I'm not going to introduce myself. The bio is online. I'm sure you read it. Thank you for reading it. I will introduce my fellow speakers. Dr. Matthew Agarwala from the Bennett Institute at Cambridge University, and I'll introduce them more in detail as they speak. Mr. Robbie Retta from South North and CDKN, who is joining us online, and Dr. Louise Crow from My Society, who is joining us online as well. I hope you can see and hear them all well. They're not speaking right now, so you probably can't hear them, but that is fine. And we're going to be talking about how do we put legislation, research, and decision-making on the speed of AI. For the last 10 years, I headed a project called the Climate Change Laws of the World at the Grantham Institute at the London School of Economics. Sometime around 2009, a group of legislators stood on the sidelines of the COP in Copenhagen and said, we really want to legislate better. We really want our climate laws to look better. but we don't even know what other laws others have if we want to do that. We want to legislate better. We want to hold our governments to account. We want to pass budgets, but we don't even know what's going on. If I'm Australia, I don't know what's going on in Japan. If I'm Japan, I don't know what's going on in South Korea. If I'm South Korea, I don't know what's happening in Norway. In order to learn from each other, we need to understand. So they tasked the London School of Economics with producing a small booklet on climate change laws of the world, which included 16 countries at the time. Over time, we grew that to a global coverage. And there's a global database of laws and policies from 200 countries, 200 national governments. And that's really nice. But is that what enables us to make decisions? A lot of us have used it for our research. Marie-Claire, who's standing at the back of the room, has used it for her research. And many of our colleagues across governments and across universities and across UN organizations have used what are the renewable energy policy of Angola, and what is the climate smart agriculture policy in Bangladesh, and so on and so forth. Is that enough for us to learn how to do policy design better? Probably not. So last year I left LSE and founded a not-for-profit startup called Climate Policy Radar, which I will tell you about shortly, that will take all of the knowledge that is accumulated and allow us a deep dive. I will do a live demo and you'll all see what I'm talking about. And when we do that, we ask ourselves, okay, how do we make sure then that that knowledge comes to be used by policymakers in a useful way? And both Louise and Robbie will be talking with us about that. Let me tell you a little bit about our journey, a little bit what we're trying to solve. I'm going to share my screen so we can all see slides. Actually, can we do the slides from yours? That would be great. And I'll just say next slide, and it'll be lovely. Next slide, please. Great. So if we want to advance our knowledge on policy approaches, we have a critical policy gap. Hands up here or virtually, if you ever did a literature review that required you to go and find out what's going on in a bunch of countries. All right, that's like almost in the entire room. And you had a limited time in order to do that. And you asked yourself, how do I do that in a useful way? So I don't have much time. I can't go to 200 countries. I can't go to 600 subnational governments in the world. I can't go to thousands of cities. So I'm going to pick my 10 countries. So already you're losing information because you're not looking, and you're probably looking at the examples that you already know. So we're already siloing ourselves. And then you, let's say that you're looking for renewable energy or for electric car charging infrastructure. So you open you located your PDFs and you open them, and then you said, okay, what am I going to do? Control find charging, control find infrastructure, control find car. And all of this process, which I'm describing in great detail, is long, tedious, inefficient, and definitely make guarantees that you're not seeing the entire picture. It also doesn't allow you to tease out different concepts and to see how this connects to that. Sorry, one more slide back. And the other thing is, if you've done a literature review online, you have connection to an internet, you have access to a university database. Your universities are probably paying a lot of money to publishers, so you can have access to all of those things. If your government did similar things in its policy design, they probably paid some consultants to do it. They have IT structure and capacity, and they're paying a lot of money for that research as well, which probably guarantees that the people who need the information the most, because in the least developed countries, for example, the ones who will be suffering the most, the ones who have the least capacity, the information is the one that is probably the most far away from reach. And that presents us with a major equity problem and a justice problem. Next slide, please. So the way that we do this like control find in your PDF process is very inefficient, right? Next slide, please. So Climate Policy Radar, a sentence about us. We celebrate our 6 months birthday today, so our half birthday today. In the 6 months since we incorporated as a not-for-profit organization, we hired a team of 6 people. And we're hiring for more, so look it up. It's always a good chance to hiring for policy people and for developers. And everything that we do is open data and open source. And I think that is critical to say that from the start. Nothing will ever be charged for in here, immediately addressing the justice problem. Next slide, please. This is our team. We gave them hard hats to show you how hard they've been working. Most of the team was hired in September. So what I'm showing you today on the 5th of November is the work of 7 weeks of teamwork that already probably is able to cut thousands of hours of research and make it deeper and more efficient. Next slide, please. So what do? We're going to search the full text of PDFs of about 1,500 PDFs. And we're going to do it intelligently. So if you search for car, we will also bring you automobiles and vehicles and mobility in a way that is trained against a huge corpus of data that understands language. We use what's called natural language processing and understanding natural language in a way that allows us to understand similar concepts without even making it specific to climate change. And we automatically generate labels and data and are able to automatically cluster information into chunks. Next slide, please. So for this demonstration, which is our very, very first prototype, and it will grow and it will be public facing, probably in the summer, we'll be able to release it for public consumption. So imagine 1,500 documents. We started with English language only. We'll move on to translation later. And there's 1.2 million sentences in those. And everything that we're doing, we're analyzing at the sentence level. And now I will share my screen, because that will be the moment to actually show you. We need to pray to the goddesses of IT now, that I am able to share my screen. Matthew, you can do some comical interventions in the meantime.
Well, be funny on demand. I mean, economists are not known for good jokes, but what I think is actually very exciting about this, I'm an economist, I'm a numbers guy, I'm a data guy. What this kind of technology can do is turn words into data. And that means that we can analyze it. We can have real hard-hitting statistical, empirical analysis of the ins and outs and the nitty-gritty of the climate laws that are established around the world. I think that's a huge resource. So I know you're going to speak about.
I am. I'm sharing my screen, but my screen is not showing on the. There we go. It is now showing. I hope that all of you can see my screen. And here it is. Policy search. Let's say that I was searching. Oh no, this is terrible. Let's make sure that the Wi-Fi works. If not, I'll show you some slides.
This may be your Bill Gates moment.
This is my Bill Gates moment. Okay, we're going to not worry about that and switch back to my slides, please. Great. And we're going to scroll down in my slides to where I can do a demo. Yes, where the slides become white, that's where we want to be. Great. I'll just show you I'll just share the sequence. It is live. The Wi-Fi in this room is terrible. This is the reason, right? Sorry, University of Glasgow and Victorian architecture. Thank you all of you for joining us today. Perfect timing. Policy search. So this is the interface, and we have 1,500 English language policies and laws from 200 national governments. Next slide, please. So let's say that I'm looking to find all of the just transition funds all over the world. You may have heard on the news that Ireland has a just transition fund, and you may have heard that somewhere else has a just transition fund. But what is your chance of finding all of the references to them everywhere? Next slide, please. So after I clicked enter in the demo, this is what happens. I will see the results sorted by relevance, which means by the accuracy and the density and the proximity of the search terms to the result on the text. Next slide, please. If I click on the first one, you will see that the sentence is open, and you can see where in the document Just Transition Fund is mentioned. You can also then, next slide, please. You see the little thumbs up and down buttons? as users, you will be able to help us understand if those results are more useful or less useful for you. By that communal and collective effort, we'll be able to improve our modeling. Because, for example, climate investment and investment climate are two very different things, right? If you think about them in context. Being able to say, actually, investment climate isn't what I want to, not what I'm after, but climate investment is what I'm after. And being able to vote down those results will help us understand natural language better in our specific context and improve the results. Next slide, please. Here's the beauty. If I clicked on that, and right now this looks blocky and annoying, but we will be improving the how this looks. This is the full text from the PDF in which just transition funds appear. I can't remember if it's on line 3 or line 4. But if we go to the next, if we clicked on the PDF icon on the side, and if you can see, this is like page 191 of 198. What is the chance if you open Portugal's National Energy and Climate Plan, you would go all the way to page 191. If we click on the next slide, we will see that that click will take us directly to page 191. This looks small, but this is thousands of hours of research saved and the ability to identify pieces of research that haven't been identified before. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. The other thing that we can do is this cluster, which has really small fonts right now, so you can't see what's going on there. I'll move up to the screen and tell you. This says sectors, and this says instruments, and this says core needs and concepts and people. We tend to think about documents piled into silos. So if I'm doing a paper on transportation, or if I'm sitting in the Ministry of Agriculture and wanting to legislate better, I will go and I will look for the relevant documents in the documents that are relevant to agriculture. But actually, humans don't need agriculture. Humans need food. And food is grown, agriculture, and moved around, transportation, and fueled by sometimes chemicals, industry. And there's energy involved in that, maybe to produce the fuels for to move the transportation. And there's socioeconomic aspects to that. And all of that is probably not going to be found in agricultural law. So what we're doing now is analyzing the concepts and the text and enabling us to understand across the range of documents, where do we have references to those relevant concepts? So if we clicked on the next slide, please. This is core needs. It says food and water and education and mobility and shelter. And if we clicked on food, for example, we would see, next slide, please. We would see the relevant set of documents that has reference to food because it read the documents and it said, oh, in somebody's just transition policy, it said that we need to justify, to make sure that food is affordable even after the coal mine has shut down in this town. And those are bridges that are being starting to being built in a way that allows us to think about concepts in a much more holistic way, in a much more connected and less dispersed way. Next slide, please. What I didn't tell you, I think that there's, of course, the ability to sift by paragraph and by language and by a lot of concepts on the side. And I'll probably park here my demonstration. Can we go up the slides? Back to the blue slides. The next one, please. So we're doing that. That's great. So this again is the work that we've done in 6-7 weeks. I'm sure you'll be excited to see what it looks like in 6 months. The next thing that we do, of course, is move from national legislation to subnational and to city level. Is move from English language only to other languages. We will do this by, to start with automatically translating and then using language-specific models that understand the context and the grammatical structure in different languages, because the translation is going to be a bit wobbly to start with. And we're going to see how we can bring that knowledge to the right place. And how we can learn from a variety of places, and how we can use community and crowdsourcing and expertise in order to enhance this, this effort. Next slide, please. So for example, if we're asking, where do we get the laws? So right now, all of the laws that are inside here come from LSE's Climate Change Laws of the World, a project that is live and kicking and wonderful and maintained by a fantastic team at the Grantham Institute. But that is one chunk. If we want data on subnational entities, so for example, 50 US states and Canadian provinces and Mexican states and so on, where do we find that? We're going to have to scrape the web. We're going to have to talk to people on the ground. We're going to have to talk to the small research organizations that have collected a database and are maintaining it for their own use, but didn't know that anybody else could use it for comparative research. And we're going to collect and connect all of those things together. Again, open source and open access. Now, what's the beauty about putting a lot of data together? You can start seeing what works. Because when you ask yourself, and let's not talk climate for a second, let's talk COVID. We're all wearing masks. Well, we're not right now, but that's because we're far away from you. We're wearing masks because there's research that showed that wearing masks reduces transmission. So somebody said there's a policy measure of wearing masks, and there's evidence in the real world of reduced transmission. How do we take that and translate that into climate policy? We need to understand, here's a set of policies, and here's a policy mix. How do we then translate that into reduced emissions, increased resilience, reduced air pollution, increased health, reduced inequalities, and so on and so forth? There's a lot of data sets out there already. In order to understand what works, we must start bringing those things together. And this is something that is so massive an undertaking that we cannot imagine doing it manually by human research, but we definitely need AI and big data approaches in order to start making sense of this big puzzle. Now that's risky and it's complicated, but we can't afford to not start. Because if we are counting on human intelligence to get us out of the climate crisis just by our intuitions, we're not going to do a very good job at resolving the crisis. Next slide, please. A shout out to our wonderful partners, LSE and the Grantham Institute, the World Policy Analysis Center at UCLA, which we've just partnered with. They do the same thing on socioeconomic policies. And we think that socioeconomic policies are as climate policies as anything else, which means that we need to start asking ourselves, how do we make those bridges and connect and not just say, if it has climate written all over it, that means it's climate change. The World Bank, South-South-North, and CDKN, we'll hear from Robbie in a minute. Robbie's the director of South-South-North, and they are our partner in knowledge brokerage, which means bringing knowledge to the users, so it doesn't just stay as a database that nobody knows about. So, and that is the most important piece of the puzzle. Next slide, please, which is the slide of thank yous from me. And back to my role as chair and my role as speaker. And I will pass on to Matthew. What I didn't tell you in the beginning of this is that each of the speakers is going to speak for about 10 minutes. I probably overstayed my welcome on this stage. And then we're going to open to Q&A. So please scribble down your questions or make a mental note, and we'll be really happy to answer them. Over to you, Matthew. Tell us what we can do with green finance, financial regulation and AI, and how we can make better decisions on that.
Well, thank you very much. I think it's not fair to speak after a presentation quite like that, and I'm going to speak without slides, but that is a very difficult act to follow. The neurons are firing. There's so many layers and potential overlap between the work that we're doing. So is this something live that we can go online? And
almost
not quite yet. Do we know
there's
when?
a request early access button
Okay.
on the website.
So
and,
what's the website we go to?
climatepolicyradar.org.
Right.
Thank you, Matthew.
Well, no, my entire team is going to request that access.
I'm sure.
So I'm going to talk a little bit about how we can use AI and tools similar, but not quite as advanced as what Mikkel and Climate Policy Radar have been developing, but in a slightly different context, moving beyond just getting the legal institutions right to address climate change, to integrating the financial institutions that we need. And one of the things that we find as economists, I'm a numbers guy, there's a lot of data out there, but data is not the same thing as knowledge. And there's a complex process that's required to turn data points into accessible, usable, actionable knowledge. And one of the challenges that we actually find is that sometimes it's as if there's too much data. And the thing that we have to try and do is find the needle in the haystack. And the more data sets that we have, the more different pieces of climate legislation we have, the more different financial metrics and ESG ratings that we have, the bigger is the haystack. But we're not necessarily making our job of finding the needles any easier. And so that's what we're trying to do. I think that we can use the AI tools to sift through those haystacks and find the needles that we're looking for. I think we can do it in law, and the tools that you're developing will be absolutely crucial for that. But we can also use those tools as economists and working in finance to identify what it is that actually works. What's the text? What are the structures? What are the principles embedded in regulation that lead to a reduction in the net flow of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere? That's the thing that counts. I'm a numbers guy. I want to know about the exchange of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. And so we started trying to do this, but working within the finance world. And you'll have seen in the newspapers, there's literally hundreds of thousands of jobs available now, some of them just from one company, in ESG. And $12 billion to be invested by PwC, £1.5 billion to be invested by KPMG in developing their ESG offerings. Now, that could be a good thing if it's evidence-based, if it's using the needles and not the haystack. But if we get this wrong, we could just mobilize trillions of dollars to do the wrong thing. And that would be really quite detrimental. Financial markets should be quite good at dealing with this stuff, right? If there's a group of people whose job it is to understand risk, to quantify it, to price it, to manage it, to sell it, it's the people in the financial markets. That's what they do. And yet, on the other hand, if there's a group of people that understand climate risk, that understand the effects that it might have on people, on lives, on countries and governments, on infrastructure, on health, and on economies, well, that group of people, it's not the finance sector, is it? Nobody would think, well, let's go to the CEOs in the financial world and ask them what's going to be the health effect of climate change, right? We have a world of climate science that speaks in terms of risk. We have a world of finance that speaks in terms of risk, and yet these two worlds have never met. And that's the problem. What we're trying to do is connect them. And the way that we can do this is by developing models to search through past environmental relationships between, say, temperature change and economic outcomes. And then build forward to take a look at, well, how will future temperature change then affect future economic outcomes? And what does this mean for governments? What does it mean for financial markets? And what does it mean for the metrics about financial risk, the credit ratings that we have? And so that's what we did. We developed an artificial intelligence model to predict a sovereign credit rating.
Can you explain to everyone what is a sovereign credit rating?
I can try. So a sovereign credit rating is simply an assessment of the creditworthiness of a government, the ability and willingness of that government to repay its debt. If you have a high rating, then your debt will be relatively cheap. If you have a low rating, you're considered a higher credit risk, less likely to be able to pay back your debt. And so investors will require a higher interest rate in order to park their money with you. If I'm not sure I'm going to get the money back, you better be promising me an awful lot. If it's a low risk, I can't charge as much because anybody will give you money. So there are companies that actually assess the credit risk of nations. They're called credit ratings agencies, and they issue financial metrics, credit ratings on an alphanumeric scale, which tells us the US is pretty likely to be able to pay its debt. Argentina, it's a higher credit risk. You should get a higher rate of return on your investments if you invest there. And these metrics are hardwired into the DNA of the existing financial system. Investors, for instance, the people managing your pensions, they know what to do when a credit rating changes. Banks know what to do when a credit rating changes, and governments know what's coming when they get downgraded. It's a higher cost of debt. And so what we did was we trained an AI algorithm, a computer program, a model, to predict past credit ratings. And predicting the past is fairly easy. What we're interested in is predicting the future. And we trained it to predict past credit ratings based on a few variables that we know climate change will affect. It's going to affect GDP. It's going to affect our growth rate. It's going to affect the productivity of the labor force. And once we built our model to predict the past ratings, a training data set, and we were able to predict the sovereign rating of countries within 1 notch on a 20-notch scale about 80% of the time, then we've got a way of saying, okay, well, how do these 6 variables of GDP and GDP growth and productivity and debt to GDP ratios, how do they respond to climate change, and how do they predict the sovereign rating? Once we have that, we can then adjust all of those variables according to climate scenarios. So we then say, well, what's the GDP trajectory of countries under RCP 2.6? What's the trajectory under RCP 8.5? These different climate scenarios from the IPCC. Once we know that, we can then create, and we did create, the world's first climate adjusted sovereign rating. So
You're just alerting you to time.
2 minutes, thank you. So why do I think this matters? I think it matters because we can actually have a climate science driven model. It starts with the science, brings in the best economic analysis that we've got, and changes real world existing actionable financial metrics. And if you can do that using these AI methods to bring in the big data, then you can start providing an evidence base for regulation, so that we can start getting rid of what could become a green bubble if we don't have credible scientific underpinnings behind our ESG metrics and our climate financial risk metrics. And then what brings it full circle, we can start developing new financial regulations that are informed by the best of the science and include them in things like your climate law evaluation tool. If we have that, we can start to figure out, well, what financial regulations actually work to reduce the net flow of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. And that's the goal.
Thank you so much. I think that it may seem like the world of finance and the world of law are completely disconnected. And in some ways they are. And I think what we are trying to do now is bring them together. Because if you're a government that has a low credit rating, then instead of us being us, the world, investing in you more to increase your resilience and to make sure that you are more likely to face the adversities that are coming your way, then investment is going away. How do we then make sure that we develop those right metrics in order to ensure that the financial flows actually enable higher resilience and lower risk, both of societies, of financial markets, and of the physical world that we're trying to protect? So we're creating a lot of knowledge, but we need to bring it to users. And with that, I would like to turn to Robbie Reda, who's the director of South North, which is an organization that I think Robbie will tell you about, and its work and what they do in order to bring knowledge and broker knowledge, so everything can be actually tied full circle and not just left in the high towers of academia and financial worlds. Robbie, please, over to you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. First, to apologize, I wanted to come in person to the venue, but my computer has not adjusted to the time here. So I thought it was two hours late when the event was going to take place, but I do apologize for that. I would like to share my screen, and yeah, I'll be, so, I am a director of South North, which is a not-for-profit entity based in Cape Town. But I'm also working on a program of South North called CDCAN in Ethiopia, and it's a global program. So I'll discuss the Climate and Development Knowledge Network, which actually focuses on knowledge brokering on climate compatible development, and it's funded and is partners with a number of organizations that you see here. So yeah, what does knowledge brokering mean for CDKN? It's, I mean, brokering as is to connect a buyer or a seller or an owner of something and the user and so on and so forth. So knowledge brokering is also a sort of linking knowledge producers to users, and you know that the farther they are, the more stretched we become. In general, it's the knowledge brokering because we've navigated this and we've read a bit about what knowledge brokering is, because it's not well articulated. Basically it's a knowledge manager, link agent, or a sort of matchmaker, and you see the activities and tasks, you know, the sort of negotiating roles, synergizing, capacity building, synthesis, and then translation, and so on and so forth. And it, you know, but the most important thing to note here is the focus is on bridging the gap between knowledge and action. As CDCAN, you know, brokering, we take as translating, adapting, communicating, and sharing of knowledge. And knowledge can be, you know, academic to indigenous to, you know, so that it's useful and relevant, and therefore, you know, maximizing the impact of evidence and learning, and ultimately enhancing leadership and collaboration. There's three pillars we work on, more or less, in knowledge brokering as CDCAN. One is, you know, tailoring evidence and learning, and then producing targeted knowledge products, you know, customized to needs. Engagement in the way of translating research to action, and peer learning, particularly peer learning between developing countries, and facilitating that. As CDCAN, we're active in over 10 countries, 9 or 10 countries, and we're operating through country engagement leaders who've established relationships and understand the needs and context of countries. I mean, there's country engagement leads and teams in some cases at the country level. And CDCAN has been around for a long time. It was set up in 2013, 2012. So it's existed for some time already. And these are, you know, country nationals. For instance, for myself, I'm also the Ethiopia country engagement lead, and I know that context a bit more. So, you know, there's the political acumen to navigate the policy landscape and so on and so forth. So, you know, the CELs are the anchors, the hinge that, you know, that we work on. So in terms of knowledge, you know, knowledge brokering, what we've noticed over time is, you know, you need one or more of this characters. You need a right entry point, you know, within a government system, within you know, responding to the governance or policy context. In the past, for instance, in the Ethiopian context, we did a lot of work with the Ministry of Environment, but then realized the Ministry of Finance had a more prominent coordination role in managing, you know, intersectoral coordinating sectors. So a right entry point within governance or in the policy context is important. Need to be the right messengers, the trust, the CEL system I talked about, and who we are. And the right timing, has to be responsive to needs at a certain point in time, because this needs change from time to time, and the right solution, relevant, right, appropriate solution is also another important element. So I did describe this a bit more, like the mess, that we are embedded within a country, hence. There's trust in that. Right entry point. We've done a bit of work in Namibia, for instance, where that there was the Namibian government asked us, are mandated to collaborate with other ministries on climate change issues, but then through the University of Namibia and our CEL there, were managed to support this coordination. And because CDCAN as a program is also interested in gender, also were able to bring in the gender ministry through discussion and information on climate change is important to them and things like that. Another right solution or knowledge, relevant, credible knowledge is the work we did around the IPCC reports. As an example, so the IPCC report is over 1,000 pages and has a lot of it's too technical, too scientific sometimes, and policy is a bit farther from it. The policy group or the decision-making group within policy circles, and in that context, we did work to further produce outputs that were accessible to policymakers. What's in it for Africa, what's in it in for Latin America and Asia. So at least something that picks out from that IPCC report and says a bit more that's accessible. There's communication, and we used a lot of infographics and other information that can be used easily by policymakers, taking that out.
Robbie, can I just say that we have only a couple of more minutes, so if we can look to wrap up, so we can give Louis some time as well.
Okay, no, so I'll do that. The other is, I guess, around doing case studies that are country specific and that were responsive. In terms of timing as well, using windows of opportunity, for instance, with the Ethiopian government at a time when Ethiopia wanted to get direct access from international climate change funds and was going to do a due diligence process. We had captured experience from other countries, so we could provide that information to the Ethiopian government, which was helpful. So that's what I'm trying to describe here. I can also talk a little bit about a case in Ethiopia around, what that timing and other things that are important.
I think maybe we leave it for a little later, if we have time.
Okay, sounds good. And thank you for that. Yeah.
Thank you, Robbie. I think one of the things that we're seeing here is a real disconnect between how governments on the ground, especially those, all of the governments in the world need to ramp up their policies and laws. That's really, really clear. There are some that are that need to accelerate even faster, and to do capacity building in a way that really requires much more. And bringing evidence into that is a really, really tricky adventure. And I think one of the challenges that we will have is seeing how we can do this like high-tech AI, just go on the database and it'll tell you everything that you want, and really ground it in reality. Because we need that knowledge to get to the people who are upgrading Ethiopia's NDC and who are working on Namibia's climate smart agriculture policy, and who need to understand and to trust the sources of information. And me, from the global north, coming with my fancy laptop and saying, here's what you need in order to do your job, is not going to cut it. And it shouldn't cut it. So we have a long way of bridging these processes, and we need to approach them with humility and care, while trying to do our jobs well, but really recognizing how much we have to bridge here. And that's also true for, of course, global north governments. They have a long way to go too. Let's not cut them any slack. Definitely not here in Glasgow. Louise, over to you to tell us two stories. And I'll just leave you to tell what those two stories are. Louise is the program director in My Society, who are doing incredible things of citizen accountability and bringing evidence on multiple levels in the UK context only, but definitely generalizable to lots of other contexts. Louise, over to you to tell us about your work.
Thanks, Mikhail. Could somebody just shout to confirm you can see my screen?
Yes.
Yeah, so really two stories, and very much building on the themes of the other speakers in this session. So really thrilled to join and to hear about some of the parallels. We're doing a little bit of, I think, what Robbie would call knowledge brokering, and a little bit of the kind of sense making of policy, all in the UK local government context. So first, a couple of words about My Society. We're a digital charity. Our mission is to use digital services and research and data to help people be active citizens and to engage democratically. We run digital services, or services are run using our code. Again, it's open source code in countries around the world. But just to give you a sense of scale, in the UK, our services have about 11 million users each year. We're working on the climate emergency because we think this is the biggest crisis facing us, but also because we think it's the democratic challenge for the rest of our lives. So why focus on UK local authorities? Well, public concern on climate change has risen in the UK steadily over the last decade. It was on a record high in 2019, prompted by things like the climate strikes, Extinction Rebellion, raising public awareness in the media. And in 2019 and 2020, about 70% of local government, local authorities in the UK declared a climate emergency. And many of those are now setting out their commitments based on those declarations in the form of climate action plans. It's striking to me that these declarations were made in the presence of a really unusual level of public engagement. So one of the campaigners at the time said, people showed up at council meetings, they were asking questions, they were packing the gallery. Councillors are not used to having people in the gallery. There were demonstrations outside as they were going in. So something kind of unusual happening in terms of public participation. But these declarations were also made in the absence of a comprehensive framework for how local authorities in the UK fit into the path to net zero. So the government here is pretty centralised. Local authorities don't have a huge amount of power. And it's worth noting that they've had 10 years of policies of austerity. So some of them are paring back services to things they absolutely have to do. So we still think it's important for a few reasons. Local authorities are responsible for around 30% of the emissions reductions we need to get to net zero. So these are reductions around things like transport, housing, food. These are policies that are going to require public consent and public behaviour change. And actually, public trust in local government is higher in the UK than it is in national government. There's also a real level of ambition in some of these local authority plans and policies. The headline promises are, in some cases, decades ahead of the national plan. But actually living up to those promises is going to take a huge shift in role for these local governments. They're going to have to go from a statutory service provider to a broader convener of local action from institutions and from citizens. And
Louise, can I check that we're still seeing the 11 million users
that's
slide? That's cool,
yeah,
right?
no, that's cool.
Great.
Yeah,
Okay.
I'm just doing a little bit of scene setting, and I'll show some
cool.
screenshots in a minute. Yeah, thanks for checking though. So we think the local level is also really interesting from a citizen point of view. So people want to act where they are. And actually, if you're looking at meaningful individual action, engaging with local policies around climate change has a high potential to have some kind of impact compared with a lot of the other things that people could do individually. And finally, there's a lot of difference in the routes to net zero. So the policies needed are actually going to be different in different areas. Just to pull out one element, there's a big urban-rural divide in the UK. So it's actually not going to be a one-size-fits-all approach. So there's loads of potential in these local action plans, but there's no guarantee. We don't know, sitting here right now in 2021, how far or how fast either emissions cuts directly from these local authorities or from their influence might go. So I was encouraged by Michal before this session to think about the dream scenario, and what would the dream scenario here be? To me, it would be one in which that level of public participation we saw in the emergency declarations is sustained and encouraged as you turn declarations into policy and then policy into action. And it would also be one in which, I think as Matthew's reference, there's a lot of scope for authorities to learn from each other, that there's actually quite a fast feedback loop for these local authorities to figure out very quickly what's working. And finally, the national policy needs to really be based in evidence and an understanding of what's happening on the ground and good understanding of local needs. Arguably, none of that is happening right now to the extent that it needs to. So thinking about technology, AI, and other digital tools, how might they help us move towards the situation we want to be in? Well, I think that one way is by making it very clear what government has committed to, what decisions they've made, what level of ambition that represents, and finally, how citizens might get involved in that decision making, how you can apply that public pressure and scrutiny. And at the moment, local government websites do not suggest that they represent institutions that encourage participation. If you want to engage with a local action plan, you first have to find it, and it might be buried away in the meeting minutes of some previous meeting of the authority. You then have quite a long policy document, maybe 20, 30, 60 pages, and you have to figure out as somebody who is not a policy expert whether this is a good plan or not, really in the absence of any context. So that's quite a high barrier to participation. And then again, as somebody who works in local government, if you want to find out what other policymakers are doing, you have to repeat that process for each policy you want to look at. So what we've been doing is working in partnership with Climate Emergency UK to again collect all the local authority action plans that we can find. So there's an element of going out into the world and pulling together lots of documents, and we've made them publicly available in one place, and that's data.climateemergency.uk. So we've again extracted the text of those documents, and that in itself offers a big transition in what you can do. So you can now search through this whole collection, and that's available in this Climate Action Plan Explorer service, where we've also started to try and offer a bit of context around these plans. So what are other councils doing? What are the emissions in this local area? Giving people a sort of start to try and understand what's going on. There's some value in this as a document collection, but bearing in mind the absence of a framework for these policies, there are huge variations in them. So some are just really focused on the council's direct emissions. Some of them are making really ambitious commitments to help the whole area reduce emissions. So we've started to try and pull out headline promises from these documents to say what actually has been committed to by these local governments. We're also experimenting with
2 minutes.
Great. We're
Thank you.
experimenting with other ways to put the policies into context. So what powers do these governments actually have that they could use? So what could they do? What are they doing? So finally, Climate Emergency UK are also training hundreds of volunteers to score these action plans. They're using a checklist built by a bunch of civil society organisations. And together we're going to try and do that process of turning these long policy documents into a series of comparable facts about the plans. So things about what data they're based on, how they'll be monitored. And we hope that's going to allow a much clearer understanding of how they're going to compare. So it's that process of turning documents into data and then trying to present that data in a way that's useful to the people making policy and useful to the people to whom that policy is going to apply. So there's a debate in the UK at the moment between central government and local authorities over whether these local authorities need more powers around the climate emergency, and central government wants to see them making the maximum use of their existing policies. This kind of information could be the evidence base that allows that debate to be an informed debate. And finally, I'll just say this, I think what we're all talking about here is a sense-making process around policy in whatever area. What I've been discussing is all information that was previously technically available, but just not in a way you could realistically absorb it or make decisions about it. And this kind of volunteer effort has been a very labor-intensive process to try and get facts out of documents. And that is one area where I think we could really be looking to usefully apply artificial intelligence. And that's something that we hope to work with Climate Policy Radar on in the near future. And I will just end by saying, as these plans, we hope, rapidly turn into action, I think that sense-making challenge just gets harder and more important, as both policymakers, analysts and citizens are going to need to understand really quickly what's working and what isn't as they start to actually try out different approaches. I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much. When I started my climate legislation journey, it was all about international agreements and national legislation, and those were the sexy bits, right? But the hard reality of local governments and where you get your are your roads fit for purpose, and are your houses insulated, and all of those things, that's where a lot of the action happens. And legislation on the national and on the local level are critical, and the ability of national legislation to allow local governments to do their job, to finance them, to make sure that the right flows of power and money and information really work without interruption, those are critical. So this is just a reminder that climate legislation isn't only about international, but the local level is really critical. Thank you so much to all of our speakers. We are, I believe, nearing the end of our session. So I'm not going to do like 5 minutes. So we're going to take critical questions from the audience, and we'll hang around because we're about to break for lunch, I believe, after this, and then we will hear some more questions. No, not lunch yet. Another session. So not lunch yet. Absolutely not. I'm an early eater. Questions from the audience to any of us? Yes, please. If you could. Yes, please. If you could. Yeah.
Just a question to Michelle for your first presentation.
Yes.
How as policymakers, we're quite siloed a lot of times, like what's happening in the UK without considering what's happening in the rest of the world. Is there a way in which this tool can be built out so that if you're, say, trying to decarbonize industry in the UK, you take into account and model the cost reduction if Australia produces lots of green hydrogen, if other countries do X, Y, and Z? Is it, yeah.
Sure. Was the question picked up by the mic? Yeah, I hope so. The question was, how can we make sure that we learn from each other well, even when we're operating in a local context? I'm generalizing your question to make sure that we can learn from things that are happening elsewhere. That is exactly what we're trying to do. Opening up a completely global, and this is, I think, what Matthew and what Louise are doing as well, opening up the comparative knowledge. So I'm not doing this right now. Let me see who's done it elsewhere and has it worked for them, and being able to model based on others' experience is exactly what we refer to as evidence-based decision-making. So I will look at Australia, and I will look at Japan, and I will look at Namibia, and I will look at Bangladesh or at Vanuatu, and I will see how they treated certain issues and how that played out for them in their mix. And being exposed to that activity, and then being able to compare it and contextualizing it in your own context and in your own national circumstances, that is exactly what we're going for. Yes, please, at the back. Yeah, I can't hear you very well. If you take off your mask or stand or come closer or something, then that might help.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. What are the criteria that you use for assessing whether a policy was good?
So right now we're not, so the question was, what was the criteria for assessing whether a policy is good or not? So in my 15 years in climate policy, I have met a lot of assessors and model builders. And there are multiple criteria, and it all depends on what question you're asking and what you're trying to solve for. What we are doing is right now not assessing anything. What we're building is the underlay, the infrastructure underneath, on which you can apply whatever criteria that you want. If you want to ask, how does this policy measure contribute to this outcome, then those are your criteria, and then you can start applying things. Now there's like basic things like governance, and is it actually budgeted, and is it planned? Do you have stakeholder participation? And what is the rate of the tax? And what is the stringency of the standard? Like you can start playing with all of that, but it really depends on what you're trying to optimize for. All of those models have to drink from the same data lake, if you think about it, right? It's a big lake, and we all stick our straws in it and our perspectives on it, but the data is right now missing. So right now we have a lot of modeling that isn't based on evidence, and what we're trying to do is build that underlayer.
I think we have 1 minute.
1 minute. So this is our last question, but then catch us later.
To Matt, leading on the excellent point by Mikhail on the disconnect between climate law and finance, which echoes like some of the complaints by development countries that sometimes credit rating agencies are not fair towards them, that sometimes that the risk assessment is unfair and developing countries, they are penalized by these agencies. And I've seen many times some countries trying to do like innovative things, and the assessment by the institution is that this is bad, not good. And actually they're trying to fix some things that are almost unanimously are wrong, like for instance, in terms of financial institutions governance and potential risk, and etc. So how do you think that your tool could, help the credit rating agencies to, evolve?
Right. So the objective of a credit rating agency is to provide markets with credible information about the riskiness of public debt. It is not to facilitate access to finance to developing countries. Those are two separate goals. They're just there to give you the creditworthiness. So that's not really their interest. And it's not the rating is it's the wrong way of doing it. On the other hand, what our results show is that it's the highest rated countries, the UK, the US, Canada, Germany, that will suffer the largest downgrades because of climate change. 63 sovereigns will get a downgrade within the next decade as a result of climate change. If we do not meet the Paris Climate Agreement, that raises to 80 different countries being downgraded. China, 6 notches on a 20-notch scale. That means it's uninvestable, it's junk. It's a huge effect. But the allocation of finance across wealthy and developing countries is not the role of the rating.
And I will conclude, and as our session comes to a close, but it is the role of the regulator. It's
Yes.
the role of the regulator to then say, this is the credit rating, and it's our job to protect this society, this community, this collection of humans, and make sure that whatever the credit rating is, they can continue to survive and thrive. And that often means overcoming existing economic models and reinventing economic models and stepping away from the silos of this is how it's done and this is what you're going to get. And that's the role of the regulator, because if we have a market failure, and climate change is the biggest market failure in the world, then we need to fix market failures by regulation. And this is where markets alone don't cut it. And this is exactly how our sessions tie together. We thank you so much here and in your homes and in your universities and wherever you're tuning in from, and all of you at this beautiful campus here in Glasgow. Thank you for joining us. Enjoy the next session, catch us for questions, and have a wonderful rest of the day. And a big shout out to Team Climate Policy Radar for pulling off this miraculous thing in time for COP. Yeah, and Marcus, who's here with us from Climate Policy Radar, catch him if you want to ask him anything about what we do.